I didn't think of it as a line at first. That's the part that still gets to me. The way it didn't feel like anything dangerous in the beginning. It just felt easy, natural even, like something that slipped into place without asking permission. His name is Ethan, and the first time I really noticed him wasn't some dramatic moment. It was just a random Tuesday afternoon in our kitchen, sunlight coming through the blinds, catching dust in the air like it always did around 4 o'clock. My son Jake had brought him over after school like he had 100 times before. They'd been best friends since sophomore year, practically inseparable. Same classes, same football team, same dumb jokes that I never fully understood but smiled at anyway. Ethan had always been polite. That was the first thing people noticed about him. He'd say yes ma'am without it sounding forced, always offered to help carry groceries if he happened to walk in while I was unloading the car. He had that kind of presence, calm, respectful, a little quieter than Jake but not shy. But that day, something shifted. Maybe it was the way he lingered in the kitchen after Jake ran upstairs to grab something. Maybe it was the way he leaned against the counter, watching me while I rinsed dishes, like he was about to say something but wasn't sure how. "You okay?" I asked, glancing over my shoulder. "Yeah," he said, but he didn't look away. I remember drying my hands slowly, turning to face him. "You look like you want to ask me something." He hesitated for a second, then shrugged, like he was trying to play it off. "Not really, just thinking." "About what?" He smiled a little, but it wasn't the usual kind. It felt more deliberate. Just stuff. That should have been the end of it. A weird, slightly awkward moment, nothing more. But it wasn't, because after that day, I started noticing things I hadn't noticed before. The way his eyes would find me in a room, even when Jake was talking. The way his tone shifted just slightly when he spoke to me. Still respectful, but softer somehow, more intentional. And the worst part is, I noticed myself noticing. At first, I told myself it was harmless. I mean, what was it really? A teenager being a little more attentive than usual? Maybe he just felt comfortable around me. Maybe I reminded him of someone. There were 100 explanations that didn't mean anything inappropriate. But none of those explanations accounted for the way my chest would tighten just a little when he walked in, or the way I'd catch myself fixing my hair before heading downstairs if I knew Jake had invited him over. It didn't happen all at once. It built slowly, quietly, like something creeping in under a door you forgot to close. One evening stands out more than the others. Mark was working late again. That had become more common over the past year. Longer hours, more stress, less conversation when he got home. We weren't fighting, not exactly, but there was this distance between us that hadn't been there before, like we were both just existing in the same space without really connecting anymore. Jake and Ethan were in the living room, half watching a game, half scrolling on their phones. I was in the kitchen, making dinner, the TV noise drifting in through the doorway. "Hey, do you guys want pasta, or should I order something?" I called out. "Pasta's fine," Jake said without looking up. Ethan didn't answer right away. I stepped into the doorway, wiping my hands on a dish towel. "Ethan?" He looked up at me then, and for a second it felt like the room got quieter. "Yeah," he said, "whatever you're making is good." It wasn't what he said. It was how he said it. There was something in his voice that lingered, something that made me hold his gaze a second longer than I should have. Jake didn't notice. Of course he didn't. That night after dinner, Jake went upstairs to take a call. I was clearing the table when Ethan started helping without being asked, stacking plates, carrying glasses to the sink. "You don't have to do that," I said. "I don't mind," he replied. We stood there side by side for a minute, the sound of running water filling the silence. "You're here a lot," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "Yeah," he said. "Your house is nicer than mine." I glanced at him. "What does that mean?" He shrugged. "It's just calmer here." Something about that hit me in a way I didn't expect. "Calm isn't always what it looks like," I said. He looked at me then, really looked at me, like he was trying to read something under the surface. "I think I get that," he said quietly. There was a pause. And then, without thinking, I asked, "You okay at home?" He hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. "Yeah," he said finally. "It's just different." I nodded, even though I wanted to ask more, but I didn't, because something about the moment felt too personal already, too close. Jake came back downstairs not long after, breaking whatever that moment was before it could turn into something else. But it didn't disappear. It stayed there, under the surface, growing. Days turned into weeks, and the dynamic shifted in ways I couldn't ignore anymore. It was in the small things, the way Ethan would sit closer to me than necessary when we were all in the living room, the way he'd find reasons to be in the same space as me even when Jake wasn't around,
and I let it happen. That's the part I can't rewrite. I didn't shut it down. I didn't create distance. If anything, I leaned into it, just slightly, just enough to keep it alive without admitting what it was becoming. There was one afternoon when everything crossed into something undeniable. Jake had practice after school, and Ethan showed up at the house anyway. I remember opening the door and feeling that immediate jolt of surprise. "Jake's not here," I said. "I know," he replied. That should have been my cue. That should have been the moment I set a boundary, told him to come back later, ended whatever this was before it had a chance to turn into something worse. But I didn't. Instead, I stepped aside and let him in. "Okay," I said, trying to sound casual. "Then why are you here?" He walked in slowly, like he wasn't entirely sure how to answer that. "I just wanted to see you," he said. Everything inside me went still. There it was, out in the open. No confusion, no misinterpretation, just the truth. I should have shut it down right then. I knew it. He knew it. But neither of us moved. I leaned back against the door after closing it, crossing my arms, more to steady myself than anything else. "You can't say things like that," I said quietly. "Why not?" "Because it's not appropriate." He stepped closer, not aggressively, just confidently. "Is it not true?" he asked. I didn't answer. Because the truth was complicated, and I was already in deeper than I wanted to admit. I didn't sleep that night, not even for a minute. I kept replaying that moment over and over again. Him standing there in the entryway, the way his voice dropped when he said he came to see me, the way I didn't shut it down the way I should have. It wasn't just what he said, it was what I didn't say back. Because silence can be an answer too, and mine had been loud. Mark came home late, like always. I heard the garage door open sometime after midnight, the heavy footsteps, the quiet clink of his keys on the kitchen counter. He didn't come upstairs right away. He usually didn't anymore.
Sometimes he'd sit in the living room with the TV on low, just staring at nothing. There was a time when I used to go down and sit with him, ask him about his day, touch his arm, try to stay connected. That time had passed without either of us acknowledging it. When he finally came to bed, I kept my eyes closed, pretending to be asleep. He slid in beside me without a word, his back turning to mine almost immediately. No goodnight, no touch, just distance. And for the first time, that distance didn't feel like something I was trying to fix. It felt like something I was already stepping away from. The next few days were strange. Not chaotic, not dramatic, just off. Like everything was happening on a slightly different frequency than it used to. Ethan didn't come by right away after that, and I told myself that was a good thing, that maybe he realized he crossed a line and was pulling back. But if I'm being honest, there was a part of me that noticed his absence a little too much. I found myself listening for the door, glancing at the driveway, wondering if Jake would mention him. He didn't. It was like nothing had changed on his end. School, practice, video games, the same routines. If anything, Jake seemed even more distracted than usual, buried in his own world, completely unaware of anything happening outside of it. And I let that continue. That Saturday, Mark had another early shift. Jake left mid-morning, mumbling something about meeting up with friends. I didn't ask questions. I rarely did anymore. By noon, I was alone in the house again. It should have felt normal, but it didn't. There was this low, restless energy sitting under my skin, like I was waiting for something I hadn't admitted I wanted. I tried to distract myself. Laundry, cleaning, even sat down with a book at one point, but nothing held my attention. My mind kept drifting back to that moment, that look on Ethan's face, that tone. I just wanted to see you. Around 1 in the afternoon, my phone buzzed. I remember staring at the screen longer than I should have before picking it up. It was him, Ethan. "You home?" My heart started beating faster immediately, which pissed me off more than anything. I didn't respond right away. I told myself I shouldn't, that this was exactly where things could still be stopped. But then another message came through. "Ethan, I'm not trying to make things weird. I just want to talk." I exhaled slowly, staring at the words. Just want to talk. That's how it always starts, right? Something simple, something harmless. I typed out a response, erased it, typed another, erased that too. And then finally, before I could overthink it anymore, I sent, "Yeah, I'm home." The 3 dots appeared almost instantly. "Ethan, can I come by?" I should have said no. I knew that. There was still time to shut the door on this, to step back into the version of my life where everything made sense, where lines weren't blurred, where I wasn't sitting on the edge of something I couldn't control. But instead, I typed, "Okay." That was it, 1 word, and it changed everything. He showed up about 15 minutes later.
I heard his car pull into the driveway, the sound of the engine cutting off, the car door closing. My chest felt tight as I walked to the front door. For a second, I just stood there with my hand on the handle, not opening it, like I was giving myself one last chance to stop. I didn't take it. When I'd opened the door, he was standing there, hands in his pockets, that same calm expression on his face. But there was something underneath it, something more focused than before. "Hey," he said. "Hey." I stepped aside, letting him in again. That felt like a pattern now, letting him in. He walked into the living room this time, not lingering awkwardly by the door like before, more comfortable, more certain. I closed the door behind him, the click echoing louder than it should have. "So," I said, crossing my arms again, needing something to ground myself. "You wanted to talk?" "Yeah." He turned to face me fully, his eyes locking onto mine in a way that made it hard to look away. "I meant what I said the other day," he continued. "I know you think it's inappropriate or whatever, but I'm not just messing around." I felt my throat tighten. "Ethan." "No, just hear me out," he said, stepping a little closer. "I'm not a kid." "That's not the point." "Then what is?" I didn't have a clean answer for that, because the truth was layered. Messy. It wasn't just about age or labels or what this looked like from the outside. It was about the way this felt, and that was the part I couldn't say out loud. "You're Jake's best friend," I said finally, like that alone should end the conversation. "I know," he said, "and I care about him. I'm not trying to hurt him." "Then what are you doing?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He paused for a second, like he was choosing his words carefully. "I think about you," he said. The honesty in it hit harder than anything else. "I shouldn't," he added quieter now. "I know that, but I do." The room felt smaller suddenly. "You don't even know what you're saying," I said, but it sounded weak, even to me. "I do," he replied, "and I think you know it too." That was the problem. I did. I could feel it in the way my body reacted when he was close, in the way my thoughts drifted when I was alone, in the way I hadn't shut any of this down when I had the chance. "You should go," I said, but I didn't move to open the door. He didn't move either. "You want me to?" he asked. I opened my mouth to say yes. That's what I was supposed to say, but nothing came out, because the truth was sitting right there between us, unspoken but impossible to ignore. I didn't want him to leave, and he could see that. He took another step closer, close enough now that I could feel the heat coming off his body, close enough that it made my thoughts blur at the edges. "This doesn't have to be complicated," he said quietly. I let out a small shaky breath. "It already is." He shook his head slightly. "It doesn't feel complicated." Of course it didn't, not to him. He wasn't the one with a husband upstairs, a life built on routines and expectations, a son who trusted both of us without question. But even as those thoughts ran through my head, they didn't stop me from standing there, from not stepping back, from not ending it. His hand moved slightly, like he was about to reach for me, then hesitated. That hesitation, that was the last moment everything could have gone differently. All I had to do was step away, say no, create space. I didn't. And the second I didn't, something shifted in his expression, something certain, something that told me we had both just crossed into something there was no coming back from. I don't remember deciding anything. That's the part that still messes with me when I think back on it. There wasn't some clear, conscious moment where I said, "This is happening now." It was quieter than that, slower, like gravity just took over. He closed the distance between us in a way that didn't feel rushed. Not aggressive, not careless. If anything, it felt controlled, like he was giving me time to stop it if I wanted to. I didn't. I could have stepped back, I could have said his name in that tone that draws a line, that reminds someone who they are to you. But I didn't do any of that.
I just stood there, feeling my pulse in my throat, my hands still crossed, like I was holding myself together, even as everything inside me started to come undone. "Tell me to leave," he said quietly. It wasn't a challenge, it wasn't manipulative. It sounded almost sincere, like he was offering me an exit, and I knew exactly what that meant. If I said it, if I told him to go, he would. This would end right there. Everything could still be undone. But instead of saying anything, I shook my head, barely, just enough for him to see it. That was it. That tiny movement. That was the moment I crossed the line. The air between us shifted immediately. Whatever hesitation had been there before disappeared, replaced by something heavier, more certain. His hand came up slowly, like he was still giving me one last second to pull away. And when his fingers brushed against my arm, I felt it everywhere. It wasn't supposed to feel like that. It wasn't supposed to feel electric. I closed my eyes for a second, just a second, like maybe that would ground me, pull me back into reality. But it didn't. If anything, it made everything sharper. "You're sure?" he asked. I nodded again. I couldn't trust my voice. And after that, things moved in a way that felt both fast and stretched out at the same time. Every small touch, every shift in distance, it all felt amplified, like my brain was recording everything, whether I wanted it to or not. There was no pretending anymore, no gray area. We both knew exactly what we were doing, and I didn't stop it. That's the truth. I didn't stop it. I wish I could say it was just physical, that it was just some impulsive, reckless moment that meant nothing, but it didn't feel like nothing. That's what made it worse. There was something about the way he looked at me, like I wasn't just someone's mom, someone's wife, someone existing in the background of someone else's life. It was direct, focused, like I was the only thing in the room that mattered, and I let myself lean into that. I let myself feel it, which is something I hadn't realized I'd been missing until that exact moment. Time blurred. I don't know how long we were standing there before I finally pulled back, breathing uneven, my thoughts struggling to catch up with what had just happened. We can't, I started, but the words didn't land right, because we already had. There was no can't anymore. He didn't look shaken. If anything, he looked more grounded than before, like something had settled into place for him. We already did, he said quietly. I hated how calm he sounded. I turned away from him, running a hand through my hair, trying to put space between us, trying to think clearly. This shouldn't have happened, I said, more to myself than to him. But it did. That doesn't make it up, hey? I didn't say it did. I looked back at him then, frustrated, overwhelmed, trying to find something in his expression that matched the chaos in my head. But he wasn't chaotic. He was steady, and that made it worse. You should go, I said again, this time more firmly. He studied me for a second, like he was deciding whether to push or not. Then he nodded. Okay. No argument, no pressure. He turned and walked toward the door, and I followed a few steps behind, my heart still racing, my thoughts still scattered. When he reached the door, he paused, his hand on the handle. This doesn't have to be a one-time thing, he said, not looking back. My chest tightened. It does, I said quickly. He glanced over his shoulder then, his eyes meeting mine again. Does it? I didn't answer, because I didn't know, and he could see that. He opened the door and stepped outside, the daylight hitting him like nothing had changed, like the world was still exactly the same as it had been an hour ago. But it wasn't, not for me. I closed the door behind him and just stood there for a long time, staring at the wood, my hand still resting against it. The house felt different, quieter, heavier, like something had settled into the walls. I walked back into the living room slowly, my legs feeling unsteady, my mind replaying everything in flashes I couldn't control. I kept expecting to feel immediate regret, panic, something sharp and clear that would snap me back into reality. But what I felt was complicated. There was guilt, yeah, of course there was, but it wasn't the only thing, and that scared me more than anything, because it meant I wasn't reacting the way I should have been. It meant a part of me didn't want to undo it. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway snapped me out of it. My heart jumped into my throat instantly. Jake. I hadn't even thought about the time. Everything in my body went into overdrive as I looked around the room, like there would be some visible sign of what had just happened. There wasn't. Everything looked exactly the same. That somehow made it worse. I rushed to the kitchen, grabbing a glass, turning on the sink, trying to make it look like I'd been doing something normal. Anything normal. The front door opened a second later. Hey, Jake called out. Hey, I replied, forcing my voice to stay steady. He walked into the kitchen, tossing his keys onto the counter, grabbing a drink without even really looking at me. Practice got canceled, he said. Coach had something come up. Okay, I said, nodding like that mattered. He took a sip, then glanced at me. You good? That question again. So simple, so loaded. Yeah, I said quickly, just tired. He shrugged, accepting that with question. Ethan texted me earlier, he added casually. Said he might come by later. My stomach dropped. Oh, I said, keeping my tone neutral. Okay. Jake didn't notice anything off. Why would he? To him, everything was still normal. Everything was still safe. And standing there in that kitchen, listening to him talk about his day like nothing had changed, I realized something that made my chest feel tight in a completely different way. I had already betrayed him. Not just Mark. Jake. And the worst part was, it wasn't over. Because when Jake said Ethan might come by later, a part of me, somewhere deep and quiet, didn't feel dread. It felt anticipation. And I didn't know what that said about me anymore. The rest of that day felt like I was walking through something I couldn't fully see. Like every step I took was on unstable ground, but I kept moving anyway. Jake didn't notice anything. He went upstairs, shut his door, probably put his headset on, and disappeared into whatever game he'd been obsessed with that week. The house slipped back into its usual rhythm, footsteps overhead, the faint hum of his voice through the floor, the occasional laugh. Normal. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been permanently altered. Like I was standing in the same house, but it wasn't the same life anymore. I tried to keep busy. I started dinner early, even though I wasn't hungry. Chopped vegetables slower than usual. Rinsed things twice. Anything to keep my hands occupied so my mind wouldn't spiral too far ahead. But it kept going back to one thing. He might come by later. That sentence just sat there in my head, looping. And I hated how it made me feel. Because I should have been hoping he didn't show up. I should have been dreading it, planning how to avoid him, how to shut it down properly this time.
Instead, I kept catching myself listening for the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. By the time evening rolled around, I was already exhausted from the mental back and forth. The sun started dipping lower, casting that orange glow through the windows, the kind that usually makes everything feel calm. It didn't feel calm. It felt like a countdown. Around 7, Jake came downstairs, grabbed a soda, and leaned against the counter like he always did. "You make dinner already?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Figured we'd eat early." He nodded, distracted, scrolling on his phone. "Ethan said he might swing by," he added again, like it was nothing. I forced a small shrug. "Okay." Jake glanced up at me for a second, then smirked slightly. "You don't mind, right?" "Why would I mind?" I said, a little too quickly. "Just asking." He didn't press it. He never did. That was part of the problem. There were no questions, no suspicion, just trust. And I was standing there, already having broken it. Dinner came and went without much conversation. Jake ate fast, like he always did, barely tasting anything, then went back upstairs before I'd even finished my plate. I stayed at the table longer than necessary, staring at nothing, my fork resting against the plate. I could still stop this. That thought came back again, louder this time. If Ethan showed up, I could keep my distance, act normal, make it clear that earlier was a mistake, draw the line properly. I repeated that to myself like it was a plan, like I actually believed it. Around 8, I heard it. A car pulling into the driveway. My entire body reacted before my brain could catch up. I stood up too fast, my chair scraping against the floor louder than it should have. I froze for a second, staring toward the front of the house, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might give something away. Footsteps outside. A car door closing. Then the knock. 3 soft taps. Jake's voice came from upstairs. "That's probably Ethan." Of course it was. I walked to the door slower this time, like I was trying to control something that was already out of my hands. When I opened it, he was there. Same as earlier, but different. There was no hesitation in his posture now, no uncertainty in his expression, just that same steady focus. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I replied, stepping aside. Again, letting him in. He walked past me, and for a second, as he moved by, our arms brushed, just barely, but it was enough to send that same sharp awareness through me all over again. Jake came down the stairs a second later, completely unaware of anything beneath the surface. "Yo," Jake said, grinning. "Thought you weren't coming." "Changed my mind," Ethan replied casually. Of course he did. The two of them settled into the living room like nothing had shifted, flipping on the TV, arguing about what to watch. The same dynamic they'd always had. And I stood in the kitchen doorway, watching them, feeling like I was looking at something I didn't belong in anymore. It was surreal, watching Ethan laugh with Jake like nothing had happened just hours ago, like he hadn't been standing inches away from me, saying things that changed everything, like we weren't carrying something between us now. I tried to act normal. I really did. I cleaned up the kitchen, wiped down counters that were already clean, moved things around just to have something to do. But I could feel it, every glance, every shift in his attention when Jake wasn't looking. It was subtle, but it was there, and it was constant. At one point, Jake got up to grab something from upstairs, leaving the two of us alone for maybe 30 seconds. That's all it took. "You okay?" he asked quietly, his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry. I didn't turn around right away. I kept my hands on the counter, gripping the edge slightly. "I told you this was a mistake," I said under my breath. "Then why don't you act like it is?" he replied. That hit harder than I expected. I turned then, just enough to look at him. "Because Jake is in the next room," I said, my voice tight. Ethan held my gaze, completely unfazed. That's not what I asked. I didn't have an answer for that, not one I could say out loud. Jake's footsteps came back down the stairs, breaking the moment before it could stretch any further. But the tension didn't go away. It just shifted. Hours passed like that. Half normal, half something else entirely. Every interaction layered with something unspoken, something that sat just under the surface no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. By the time it got late, Jake started yawning, stretching out on the couch. "You staying over?" he asked Ethan. There it was, that casual question, the kind that had happened 100 times before without meaning anything. But now it felt loaded. Ethan glanced at me for a split second before answering. "Yeah," he said, "if that's cool." Jake shrugged. "Yeah, obviously." Of course it was obvious. It had always been obvious. "Cool," Ethan added. And just like that, the situation locked into place. He wasn't leaving. I felt something twist in my chest, a mix of nerves and something else I didn't want to name. Jake eventually dragged himself upstairs, mumbling something about being exhausted. Ethan stayed for a few minutes, pretending to scroll through his phone, waiting. I knew he was waiting. I could feel it. When Jake's bedroom door closed upstairs, the house went quiet again. Too quiet. Ethan stood up slowly, setting his phone down on the coffee table. "Is he asleep?"
he asked. Not yet, I said, but he will be. There was a pause. Then he took a step toward me. You said this was a mistake, he reminded me. I know, but you don't feel like it is. It wasn't a question. I didn't answer. Because I couldn't. Because he was right. And we both knew it. That silence stretched between us again, heavy and charged, the same way it had earlier. But this time it felt different, more dangerous. Because now it wasn't just a moment, it was a choice. And I was about to make it again.